If the official story is clean, why does every powerful person around this keep sounding nervous when one name comes up? Because the second you follow the money, the politics, and the sudden reversals, this stops looking like gossip and starts looking like a system. And if that system protected the wrong people for years, then the real question is not what happened. It is who got to decide what the public was allowed to know. So let's get into the part everybody keeps circling without saying out loud. Wait, how does this story keep getting bigger every time people try to bury it? It is the official version that feels weird, not the questions. And then Trump goes from release it to it is a hoax, like that is normal? That pivot is so wild it almost sounds written by somebody else. People do not flip that hard unless something is touching somebody important, or unless they think their base will just follow the new line anyway, which is honestly the ugliest part of politics. The craziest detail is still the client list because that is the whole movie. If there is no list, fine, say there is no list and show the files. But the energy around it is always like, please stop asking. That alone makes people ask twice as hard. Do you think this is mainly a criminal case or a power case? It feels like a power case that used criminal behavior as glue. Because suddenly you have billionaires, politicians, and maybe intelligence people in the same sentence. And once intelligence gets mentioned, everybody starts acting allergic to details. Which is funny because details are usually the entire point. The thing that gets me is the bipartisan weirdness of it. One side wants to weaponize it, the other side wants to memory hole it. And the survivors get treated like inconvenient evidence. That is the part people should be angriest about. When lawmakers like Ro Khanna and Nancy Mace are both pushing transparency, that says something. It says the issue is too hot to keep pretending it is partisan. When those two are on the same side, your cover story is cooked. I respect that they are forcing the vote instead of just talking online. Because online outrage disappears, but a vote has receipts. And the resistance is so dramatic, like what exactly are they protecting? That question is why this never dies. Every time they say nothing to see here, people hear, there is definitely something there. It is the worst possible communication strategy. But do you buy the intelligence angle at all? I think it is plausible enough that it needs sunlight, not vibes. Because trust us has never been a strong public relations campaign. Especially when overclassification is basically a built-in excuse machine. They can hide almost anything behind national security language. And then the public gets told they are crazy for asking. That is what makes this feel bigger than one predator. Because if the system protected him, then the system is the story. And nobody wants to look at the system when a villain is easier. That line about the women in junior high really lands hard. Because it strips away the political fog and leaves pure cruelty. Calling that a hoax is just demeaning. You cannot seriously tell on-camera victims they are a messaging problem. That is such a cold thing to do in public. And the insane part is people still try to make it about team sports. Because team sports are easier than moral accounting. Moral accounting is a brutal phrase, but yes. If you are protecting a powerful man, you are protecting a whole ecosystem. That is why the client list matters so much. It is not gossip, it is a map of leverage. And leverage is basically the currency of elite circles. Which is why people assume blackmail before they assume coincidence. Coincidence does not usually leave that many screaming clues behind. But then why do some people push back so aggressively? Because once names appear, the denial game gets expensive. And reputations can be managed but not erased. Especially not in the internet age, where everyone keeps screenshots forever. I also think the public senses when elites are panicking. Panic makes people say louder versions of the quiet thing. Like suddenly calling everything a hoax, which is such a tell. Because if it were truly nothing, you would not need the theatrical denial. Exactly, you would just release the thing and move on. What I liked about this transparency push is they are making it procedural. Not just vibes, not just podcasts, but actual pressure points. The government hates paperwork when paperwork might expose government. That is painfully accurate. And the bipartisan angle makes it harder to dismiss as one party's obsession. Exactly. Because when people from different camps want the files, the excuse weakens. Unless the whole system just quietly agrees to stall forever. Which is what people fear anyway. Do you think the public actually gets a full release? Not all at once, because institutions love partial truth as a survival tactic. But even fragments could blow up the story if they are real. Truth has a funny habit of being inconvenient, especially when everyone has spent years pretending not to see. That is probably why this keeps resurfacing every few months. Because unfinished scandals do not disappear, they ferment. Ferment is such a disgusting but perfect word. And every new denial just feeds the suspicion machine. Yeah, they keep acting surprised that people do not buy the script. Because the public is not asking for a movie, it is asking for names. And accountability, which somehow feels like the rarest thing on earth. I guess that is the real ending here, right? Either the files come out or the silence becomes the evidence. And that is why people will not let this go. Because once you smell a cover-up, you cannot unsmell it. Yeah, and now everybody wants to know who is sweating the most. Probably the exact people telling us not to worry about it. Which is always the funniest possible warning sign. When they say nothing to see here, I hear panic. Especially when the thing is allegedly nothing. That's the part people keep missing, though. This is not just about one man. It's about who got protected around him. And who decided the public did not deserve to know. Bro, that's the whole fight right there. Because if the list is meaningless, release it. If it's fake, embarrass everybody and move on. But somehow that option becomes impossible. That is what makes everybody suspicious. And then Trump comes in making noise about it. Like he was literally talking like a guy ready to blow it open. I'd be inclined to do the Epstein is wild phrasing. That sentence should have come with a warning label. But that is why the reversal hits so hard. You cannot hype transparency and then call it a hoax. People notice that kind of switch instantly. And then they ask, what changed behind the scenes? That's the uncomfortable question, isn't it? Because politicians only get this defensive when the list has weight. Exactly, nobody screams this loud over an empty folder, unless the folder is full of very expensive names, and the survivors get dragged into the middle of it. That's the ugliest part to me. They keep acting like transparency hurts the innocent. But the victims were already hurt first. So why is the empathy always selective? Because power is very organized and pain is not. That's annoyingly true. And then you get this weird bipartisan theater around it, which is rare enough to make me nervous. Ro Khanna pushing it, Nancy Mace pushing it, Massey pushing it. That coalition alone tells you something is off. Because those people do not naturally end up in the same lane. You usually need a meteor strike for that. Or something so rotten it breaks the usual lines. And then you start hearing the intelligence chatter again. The whole Epstein as a creation of some agency theory, which, to be fair, sounds insane until you look at the behavior. The access, the protection, the plea deal, the reset. It does not feel like normal rich guy corruption. It feels like infrastructure. Like he was plugged into systems, not just people. And that is exactly why the public distrust is so massive. Because if the system can hide this, what can it not hide? That's the really depressing question. And you saw them all doing the same dance in D.C. Senators, reps, everybody carefully stepping around the landmine, which is never a great sign of innocence. Nobody was leaning in and saying, release everything, let's go. They all want controlled transparency, which is not transparency. It's just damage management with better lighting. Beautifully lit nonsense. And the public can feel that fake tone instantly. That is why conspiracy thinking grows in these gaps. Not because people are stupid, but because they're denied closure. A vacuum always gets filled, especially when the official story sounds curated. Curated is a polite word for suspicious. That should be on a banner in Washington. But let's be honest, the real fear is precedent. If this opens, what else starts opening? Suddenly everybody's old emails look very alive. Everybody's vacation photos become documentary evidence. Every yacht becomes a crime scene somehow. That's why elites love the phrase moving on. Moving on is just another word for bury it. But this story refuses to stay buried. Because the moral pressure keeps coming back. And because people remember the victims more than the excuses. That part matters a lot. The public is basically saying, whose side are you on? And the wrong answer is always the polished one. The polished one usually has a donor attached. That is disgusting and probably accurate. What I cannot shake is the timing of Trump's shift. Because it feels less like conviction and more like containment. Like somebody told him, no, do not touch that drawer. And he went, wait, what is in the drawer? Exactly. And now everybody wants the drawer opened. Which is why this thing will not die. The more they slap it down, the bigger it gets. That is how bad cover-ups work. They are basically promotional campaigns, accidentally viral corruption. And if they ever do release it, the first battle is interpretation. Because the names will matter, but so will the context. Though the first instinct will be pure panic. Everybody will suddenly become a principled reformer. Overnight ethics professionals, all of them. But the bigger test is whether anyone actually follows through. Not tweets, not outrage, actual follow-through. Because survivors do not need more performance. They need the truth treated like it costs something. And maybe that's why this keeps landing so hard. It makes everybody choose between comfort and truth. Comfort usually wins until it looks guilty. Then everybody discovers courage very fast. But the public is already past that moment. They want the names, the links, the receipts. And honestly, that is not unreasonable. If powerful people were protected, they should be exposed. If they were not, prove it cleanly. Weird how simple honesty sounds revolutionary now. That is the whole tragedy, really. Yeah, and the fact people still care means something healthy remains. But why does every administration suddenly get allergic to sunlight? Because sunlight has a weird habit of showing fingerprints. Exactly, and this one has too many fingerprints to count. What gets me is the performance of outrage when survivors are still asking basic questions. They always act like transparency is some crazy radical demand. Bro, the whole thing sounds simple until you remember who might be in it. That is exactly why people are suspicious of the slow walk. And then Trump goes from release it to hoax like a switch flipped. That flip is doing Olympic-level gymnastics. You cannot campaign on transparency and then act offended by the question. Unless the question got too close to somebody he likes. Or somebody who remembers dinner parties. That is the dark joke people keep making because the alternative is worse. The bipartisan part is what makes it harder to dismiss. When Ro Khanna and Nancy Mace are both pushing this, something is off. And Thomas Massie being in the mix too just makes it weirder. The coalition is basically people with different flags, same suspicion. Which is usually what happens when the cover-up gets too big to belong to one side. Do you think it is really about one list or the whole machine around it? It is never just one list. It is the network around the list. Right, because the list is just the doorway, not the house. That is actually a good line, annoyingly good. And inside the house is where the real embarrassment lives. The intelligence angle makes people go wild, but it is not crazy to ask. Especially when a guy like that gets sweetheart deals that feel surreal. Some stories only look impossible because normal people never get that kind of protection. Exactly. Regular people do not get one weird plea deal and a whole cloud of silence. And the weirdest part is everybody acts shocked that people suspect coordination. Yeah, after decades of bad behavior with no consequences, what a mystery. That is not even cynical, that is just pattern recognition. The survivors are the part I keep coming back to, because they are the only reason this cannot stay an abstract elite mystery. When people call it a hoax, they are not just dodging facts, they are erasing people. And that is why the language around this gets so disgusting. You can debate filings and timelines, but not the existence of victims. Yet politicians keep doing this moral tap dance like it is harmless. Moral tap dance is brutal but accurate. It is brutal because the choreography never changes. Public demand rises, then somebody says nothing to see here, and it stalls. Then a few weeks later, they act surprised people still care. Like a fire alarm is annoying for being correct. That is exactly the vibe. What I respect is when lawmakers actually force the conversation instead of hiding behind process. Ro Khanna doing that is not nothing. Nancy Mace doing it is also not nothing, even if people hate the optics. Honestly, the optics are the point, because they break the usual script. If this were fake, the response would not need so much defensive theater. Why is the instinct always to protect institutions before victims? Because institutions protect each other, and that is the ugly answer. Yeah, and people feel that instinctively even when they cannot prove it yet. That is why the public pressure matters more than the speeches. Do you think the files ever come out cleanly? Cleanly? In Washington? That is adorable. Fair, I walked into that one. They will probably leak, redact, stall, and then call it transparency. And everybody will pretend that was the plan all along. But even a messy release would still crack the wall a little. That is the hope, Because even cracks matter when the wall is this old. The real test is whether people keep pushing after the first wave. Right, because they count on outrage getting tired. And that is where they win most of the time. Not through arguments, through exhaustion. That might be the most depressing, efficient system ever built. Government by fatigue. Honestly, that is almost too real. Still, this case has staying power because it touches power, class, and fear all at once. And because people know there are names somebody really does not want said out loud. That is the whole thing, isn't it? The moment names matter more than slogans, the game changes. Suddenly, everybody discovers principles. Principles are very popular right before a subpoena. That is nasty, but yes. I keep wondering whether Trump's reversal is fear, loyalty, or just calculation. Probably all three, which is annoying. Leaders usually explain themselves with one reason, but reality is messier. The public just wants the simplest answer that matches the behavior. And right now, the behavior looks like dodge, delay, and denial. Which is exactly why people keep digging instead of moving on. And maybe that stubbornness is the healthiest thing in the whole mess. The weirdest part is how fast this turned from release the files to please stop asking. That switch alone makes people lean in harder. Because if it was nothing, they would be acting like it was nothing. Instead, it feels like everybody is suddenly allergic to sunlight. And the phrase client list is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. I mean, if powerful people are named, that changes everything. That is exactly why nobody wants to touch it cleanly. They keep calling it a hoax, but the victims are real. That part drives me nuts because you cannot wave away testimony like smoke. Especially when people were kids. That junior high detail is the kind of thing that should end the debate. Instead, somehow it becomes a branding exercise. And then Trump's old comments come back like a boomerang. "I'd have no problem with it" is not a subtle quote. Not subtle at all, which is why the reversal feels so loud. People hate hypocrisy more than they hate complexity. Do you think that is why this story keeps surviving? Because every side keeps tripping over its own words. It's like nobody can delete the receipts fast enough. And the bipartisan pressure makes it harder to dismiss as pure theater. When Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie start sounding similar, that is odd. That is when the room gets very uncomfortable. Because the issue stops being team sports and becomes accountability. Which politicians love in speeches and hate in practice. Do you buy the intelligence angle at all, or is that too slippery? I mean, it is always slippery until somebody opens a file. The bigger point is that people with access seem protected. And that protection is what makes ordinary people furious. Nothing wakes up a country like rich people acting untouchable. That is the most true sentence of the day. But if the files are so explosive, why leak around them instead of releasing them? Because partial leaks keep the pressure on without fully detonating the room. Which means somebody is managing the blast radius. And that is the part that feels darkest to me. Not the scandal itself, but the choreography around it. The way people keep saying nothing to see here makes it worse. Yeah, that phrase is basically gasoline now. Because when institutions get defensive, they look guilty even if they are not. But in this case, they have earned the suspicion. And the survivors are the only reason this does not become pure gossip. Exactly, their accounts force the conversation back to harm. Without them, this would just be rich people fan fiction. Dark fan fiction, but still. The question is whether transparency actually means anything when power is involved. Sometimes transparency is just the first battle, not the finish line. And sometimes it is the thing everyone promises right before disappearing. That is painfully accurate. I keep thinking about how people said question authority like it was a hobby. In moments like this, it is not a hobby, it is hygiene. Hygiene is a perfect word for it. If you do not inspect power, power starts inspecting you. That line belongs on a wall somewhere. But do you think the public has the patience for a slow answer? Not really, because the slow answer usually means the ugly answer. People can handle pain better than they can handle disrespect. And this whole saga reeks of disrespect. Even the language around it feels manipulative. Everything is either a hoax, a distraction, or a very inconvenient fact. That's the entire modern political dictionary. The real test is whether anyone actually forces release without blinking, and whether they survive the retaliation if they do. That part feels almost more believable than the cover-up itself. Because people with leverage do not like losing it. Exactly, and this is leverage over reputations, careers, maybe institutions. which is why a full dump would probably wreck the room. And probably half the people in it. Still, the public keeps asking the same basic question: why hide it? Because whatever is in there is more dangerous to them than the outrage outside. That is the part nobody can comfortably say out loud. And yet everybody seems to know it anyway. Yeah, that is the circus part of it. The public may not know every name, but it can smell a guarded secret, especially when the people guarding it keep changing the story. So what happens if they actually release it? Then the conversation stops being abstract and gets very personal, which is exactly why so many people are stalling, and why people keep pushing anyway. Honestly, good. Because if the truth is ugly, it still beats a polished lie. That is the entire fight, isn't it? Pretty much who gets protected and who gets exposed. And every time people ask that, somebody gets nervous. Good, let them sweat a little. But the weird part is how fast it turns tribal. Suddenly, everybody discovers principles after the camera turns on. That is what makes this so gross. Because the issue is not even complicated at the core. It's just who knew what and who buried it. And why does that question scare grown adults so much? If the answer is clean, you print it and move on. The panic tells you something is sitting under the floorboards. And Trump makes it messier because he already talked like the opposite guy. That's the funniest part, honestly, if it weren't so bleak. He sounded eager until the heat got real. Then suddenly it's all hoax language and political fog. That shift is what people keep hammering him on. Because you can't pretend you were a transparency guy yesterday and a denial guy today. Well, people try that every day in politics. Sure, but this one has victims attached to it. That's why the hoax line lands so badly. It sounds like dismissing pain to protect power. And then lawmakers start smelling blood, right? Ro Khanna, Nancy Mace, Thomas Massie, all of them suddenly matter. I love how weird coalition politics gets when everyone is mad enough. The bipartisan moment is always one scandal away from breaking loose. But this feels different because it touches elite protection directly. Not just a bad guy, but the network around the bad guy. That's the part people keep circling without saying out loud. Because once you say network, everybody starts checking the ceiling. And then the intelligence chatter comes in like gasoline. People hear that and either roll their eyes or dive in head first. But even the rumor of intelligence ties changes the whole mood. Because then it stops being random celebrity dirt. It becomes state power hiding inside a criminal case. That is the thing that really freaks people out. Not the island, apparently, but the paperwork around it. The island is cinematic. The files are what terrify them. Because paper tells you who signed off, who knew, who looked away. And nobody wants their name in that version of history. Especially if they were pretending to be moral the whole time. Politicians love morality until it becomes searchable. That's actually the cleanest sentence anyone has ever said about Washington. But do you buy the full cover-up framing? Or do you think people overshoot because the story is so huge? I think the scale makes paranoia feel rational. When the official answer feels curated, people go hunting. And honestly, they are not wrong to keep asking. Because the cover story keeps changing shape. 1 minute it's nothing, then it's a hoax, then it's classified. That's not confidence, that's a smoke machine. A very expensive smoke machine with lawyers. And the survivors are sitting there watching adults play language games. That part should make everybody uncomfortable. What gets me is how the debate keeps collapsing into party loyalty. Like the moral question has to wait for the team jersey. That is insane when you say it out loud. But that's politics, baby, apparently. If your side did it, you minimize it, and if the other side did it, you weaponize it. And the truth gets caught in the middle like it owes rent. Still, the bipartisan pressure is interesting because it can break that script. When Nancy Mace and Ro Khanna are on the same planet, something is happening. Same planet is generous, but yes, I get you. The moment weird alliances form, the establishment starts sweating. Because that is when the usual excuses stop working. And then the question becomes, who blocks the release and why? That's where it gets real fast. If the list is nothing, release it and humiliate everyone. If it is something, then the silence makes perfect sense. That's the terrible logic people keep returning to. And it is not hard to understand why. Because secrecy always looks innocent until it doesn't. Then it looks like everybody in the room forgot how microphones work. I do wonder whether people want justice or just confirmation. Those are not always the same thing. Justice means evidence, due process, survivors, consequences. Confirmation means your favorite theory gets a gold star, which, to be fair, is extremely human. But if people chase fantasy, the powerful hide behind the mess. That is probably why this story survives every attempt to bury it. Because there is enough real dirt to keep the questions alive, and enough institutional weirdness to keep feeding suspicion. It's the perfect storm for distrust, which is bad but also self-inflicted. If you act shady, people invent a whole ecosystem, sometimes correctly, which is the annoying part. The real test is whether anybody actually opens the thing fully. Not selectively, not theatrically, fully. Because half-truths just buy time for the same people. And people can smell that from a mile away now. Social media made everyone suspicious and weirdly educated. Dangerous combination for anyone trying to disappear a story. So yeah, the files matter because they test the whole system. Not just one man, but who gets shielded when power is involved. And that question is still sitting there, untouched. Which is exactly why people won't let it go. You can't bury a question that obvious forever. Eventually, somebody hands you the shovel back. And then everybody pretends they always wanted accountability,